I could see the river glimmering through the trees. The sunlight had made it like crystals shimmying amongst one another, and in seeing it, I wondered somehow about Paul, the Apostle's claim. The one where he said we see God, but only through a glass, darkly. I witnessed this sight from my fourth-floor apartment. I stood at that window and I watched the river gleaming, following the highest point of gleam as it continued down the river's bend, sometimes invisible beyond the trees. Other times, the shining fractals of it would be unobscured and wonderful in their glory. Occasionally, I'd see people appearing like little dots along the opposing riverbank. They'd seem to sit or kneel, sometimes stand, and I wondered if they could see what I was seeing, beyond just the naked surface of it. The little people would then disappear into the tree line of the opposing bank, or they'd walk down in its length in either direction until they were beyond my sight. It felt silly to say, but I would always feel a great relief every time I'd see them go. I stood there, watching the traveling glimmer, and thinking at what it held beneath until the sun began to droop in the sky. The leaves of the trees either diminished to a dull green, or they paradoxically seemed to glow like the brightest version of themselves. Realizing that I'd be losing natural light soon, and knowing that it felt draining to work in the harsh and artificial light glowing from a bulb, I took my eyes off the dreamlike river and turned around. Around me was only a mess. Dishes undone, rags, papers, and plastic bags strewn about. In the air, a playground for flies. The light of the sun could barely find its way inside, and the light that did stray inward only served to accompany the dreariness. I went to move forward, and when I did, I almost tripped over a set of weights. Feeling a rage bubbling, I consoled myself with the thought that I could get rid of them now. Half the things here, if not the majority of it all, didn't belong to me. And because it didn't, and because it had no use to me, it could go now. I went to the sink and bringing up the empty ice cream pail to it, tilting it against the lopsided pyramid of dishes in order to get it under the tap. I filled the pail with water. When it was mostly full, I shut off the tap, grabbed the sponge, and went down the hallway. The second door on the left, one beyond my bedroom, was the bedroom of my roommate. I was so used to peeking in and seeing him sitting there, either at his computer or on his bed reading something, saying nothing even when I knew he could see me through the corner of his eye, that when I looked inside this time, just like every time for the last few days, I was half startled to see nobody there. I walked inside and thanked God that his room was still catching some sunlight. Last time I had to work with the buzzing of the light bulb, seeming to get louder above with each passing second. I had almost punched a hole in the wall listening to it. It was good that I hadn't, as I didn't have any more frames for any extra holes. The mattress sat aside in the center of the room. It was now mostly dry, but it had been irreparably stained and made useless. Over by the wall, within the steel and empty bed frame, sat the container of bleach. For the sake of convenience, I stopped putting it away. It sat where it had for the past few days. I stepped over within the frame, and then I knelt down. I lifted up the sponge and strained it into the bucket. While I did, I looked at the wall. I had my work cut out for me. But it was okay. I'd take it one day at a time. The sponge was now perfect, and I pressed it against the wall, watching it bubble out through its pores, some of it going red as it ran down the wall. Once it was flat, I lit off of it a bit. And then I began to rub the sponge against the wall in large circles, the diameter of which always increased, until reaching a certain point, and then I'd put the sponge back in the bucket, quench it with water, and do it all over again. The wall would begin to go pink, and I'd do it again. It would go pinker, and then again. Maybe I'd have to paint the walls pink. After a while, I don't know how long at all, the pink of the walls was so dull I could barely see what was clean white wall and what was pink. Sometimes the red would look like pink too, or vice versa, and I wouldn't know what to clean. I looked out the window, and I could see that glimmer of sky was dying down. I watched the dullness of the water as I lowered my sponge. I was so preoccupied on the river through the trees that my sponge missed the bucket altogether, and I could feel something both hard and soft pressing up through the sponge like an imprint, making sensation in my right palm. I looked down at the sponge. There was definitely something underneath it. I moved it. I saw what was sitting there. On the carpet, over a crusty puddle of red, was an ear. It was the strangest thing. I hadn't noticed it before. It sat there, and at first, I wasn't sure that that's what it was. It was getting dark out after all. But then I touched it, and I knew I was right. How did I miss it? I knew that I had a bad eye for details, at least when it came to parts of life that weren't nice to look at, the boring stuff. But I felt like I had really outdone myself this time. I looked at the ear. The red on it was dry. It was a little wet, but it seemed to be all from the splashing of the water. It must have come off in the kerfuffle. I was coming down real hard. It was funny to me that he was the one who worked out, but I was the one who turned out to not know my own strength. I kept my eyes on it, looking at all its ridges. It looked so strange on its own. And then I noticed I was having a hard time making out what was what. Everything was so dark, I would need the light bulb soon. But the sound... I wondered what Paul the Apostle thought, if he'd agree that we could hear the devil through the sheet dimly or something of that sort. Sometimes I felt like I could. It really made me feel terrible. I really needed the light now if I wanted to continue, but I couldn't. The buzzing of it was the reason why we got into our last fight to begin with. The way it would be coming through my walls and under my door deep into the night. He couldn't understand that, no matter how many times I'd scream. When he started to become afraid, I thought he could now hear it too. But he kept turning it on, and he'd close his door, and he'd lock it. He thought it was enough, and I'd knock. I'd knock really hard. But he wouldn't answer. But it was all finished now. When I was finished, the first thing I did was shut off that awful light. That's probably why I didn't notice he was missing something. I wrapped him up in the black dark. Only a little moonlight from outside came in. I could see it round on the river. It was a good light, the kind I liked to look at, the kind that made no sound. I held the ear in my hands, and a terrible thought occurred to me. What if, while I was working for the last few nights, it could hear the buzzing just like I could? It troubled me to think about it. That I had been upsetting it, and it couldn't defend itself because it never had a mouth to speak with. I would have shut it off the second it asked. We would be partners in crime for that. I looked down at it sadly. I looked back outside and saw the river a bright orange through the trees. It looked like an inferno, burning bright as seen through a glass. The sun was setting. It would be dark, inside and out. I couldn't see the ear anymore, but I felt it in my hands. And I knew it could hear me. I told it that I was going to give it back its mouth, but only on the condition that it wouldn't speak too loudly. I didn't want it to be found. It couldn't tell me, but I knew it understood. I left the room without turning on its light, and I knew that I would come back to the apartment and get to be in the perfect darkness. And without the buzzing. I put on my coat before I went. It got cold near the river, but I was excited. I knew how pretty the water looked in the moonlight when it rippled.